In 1914, Europe was at the peak of its power. The great powers had created vast empires across the world and assembled armies larger and more formidable than anything history had ever witnessed. That summer, however, those enormous forces would be turned against each other. Each nation believed it would crush its enemies in a short and glorious war. But instead, the events of 1914 dragged Europe into an abyss that seemed to have no end. In the decades leading up to the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, industrialization produced massive growth in wealth and urbanization. But it also deepened inequalities within society. The ruling classes were forced to deal with the tensions this created, and encouraging nationalism and pride in imperial expansion became a way to redirect the anger and energy of the popular classes toward other places, even though this brought new problems abroad. By the late 1800s, Britain, France, and Russia had already established vast empires when another major power emerged. Germany became a unified state in 1871 and eventually began creating its own overseas empire and building a powerful blue water navy, both to satisfy its growing commercial class and to counter the strong influence of social democratic parties at home. Germany's ambitions for its place in the sun sharply increased tensions among the great powers, who were already competing with one another. Great power rivalries became woven into popular culture through jingoistic newspapers, militaristic schooling, and everything from children's toys to thriller novels, and even movies centered on military achievements or dangerous enemies. These political and social tensions created growing anxiety among Europeans, while the possibility that they could lead to war became greater as militarization increased. As the great powers expanded their empires and feared their rivals, they also strengthened their military forces and political alliances. Germany's expansion and naval buildup triggered responses from the other powers. The UK answered by constructing even more ships, including the new dreadnought class. Meanwhile, Austria-Hungary and Russia competed for influence in the Balkans, where newly independent states had largely replaced the weakened Ottoman Empire with Russian assistance. By 1914, an alliance system tied most of the great powers to one another, for better or worse. France and Russia had been allies since 1894, while the Triple Alliance linked Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Britain had followed a policy of splendid isolation through much of the 19th century, but its concern over German naval expansion moved it closer to the Franco-Russian bloc, forming the Triple Entente. The danger of these alliances was that a conflict involving one or two powers could easily pull all of them into a European war. Germany believed it was surrounded by possible enemies, so it sought to test Entente determination during two diplomatic crises in Morocco in 1905 and 1911. The British and French stood firm, but no war followed, angering German Chief of Staff Helmuth von Moltke. If we once again escape this affair with our tail between our legs, and if we cannot force ourselves to make a determined claim which we are ready to enforce with the sword, I shall despair of the future of the German Empire. I shall then resign, but before submitting my resignation, I shall move to abolish the army and put ourselves under Japanese protectorate. We shall then be able to make money without interference and develop into ninnies. Germany's fears about its position in Europe led its government to shift focus from the navy, which had angered Britain, back toward the army, prompting France and Russia to enlarge their armies. To many in Berlin, it appeared that time favored the Entente, and Germany's chances would improve if war arrived sooner rather than later. Historians still debate whether Germany's assertiveness or Franco-British unwillingness to share international power played the larger role in escalating tensions. While great power alliances hardened across Europe, further trouble was developing in the Balkans. The Austro-Hungarian annexation of Bosnia from the Ottomans in 1908 angered Russia and Serbian nationalists, who wanted closer connections with South Slav populations inside Austria-Hungary. Russia then backed the independent Slav states in the Balkans during the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, when Serbia gained territory. Tensions between Austria-Hungary and Russia rose sharply over the Serbian question, and became even worse when Austrian counterintelligence officer Alfred Redl was revealed as a Russian spy in 1913. Long-term causes of the war, such as imperial competition or military alliances, did not make war unavoidable. For a full-scale war to erupt, a crisis had to arrive that would force governments to choose war. Sarajevo on June 28, 1914. Serbian nationalist Gavrilo Princip assassinated Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie in Sarajevo. Those gunshots set off the July crisis. After the killings, Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia. Most historians now agree that there was some semi-official Serbian involvement in the crime, although whether Serbian Prime Minister Nikola Pai and the rest of his government knew about the plot remains debated. In any case, in 1914, there was no proof of Serbian involvement. The assassination itself did not cause war. Austria-Hungary was disappointed that other European governments failed to condemn the killings more strongly. A view shared by German ambassador to Russia Friedrich von Portals, not only in the press, but also in society, one meets almost only with unfriendly judgments on the murdered Archduke. But the Serbian response mattered most to Austria-Hungary. Officially, Pai offered condolences but also argued that the assassinations were an internal Austro-Hungarian matter. The Serbian investigation lasted only 1 week and discovered no evidence of government involvement. Serbian nationalists and newspapers were less diplomatic. Some openly blamed the Austro-Hungarians themselves for the killings, while others praised the assassins. When the Austro-Hungarians protested, Pai said he had neither the means nor the desire to censor Serbia's free press. Back in Vienna, the Imperial Council gathered to consider their choices. Chief of Staff Franz Conrad von Hetzendorf had strongly argued for war for years, and he was not alone. The Foreign Ministry received letters from Austro-Hungarian notables demanding an armed response. Austrian artist Joseph von Storch wrote on June 30 last year, "I took the liberty of writing to say that we would have to learn how to tolerate Serbian impertinences without resorting to war." Now, the matter has acquired an entirely different aspect. Conrad stated it even more bluntly. The Austrian government chose a military response to punish Serbia and settle the problem of Greater Serb nationalism, which was viewed as destabilizing the empire. The war was intended to be local and brief, but attacking Serbia meant risking conflict with Russia, and for Austria, that was impossible to consider without German backing. After the assassinations, the German ambassador in Vienna had urged caution, but on July 6, Kaiser Wilhelm made Germany's position clear by giving Austria the so-called blank cheque. Austrian ambassador Count Laszlo Schleini-Marich reported the German promise to Vienna. "The Kaiser authorized me to inform our gracious Majesty that we might rely upon Germany's full support if we had really recognized the necessity of warlike action against Serbia. Kaiser Wilhelm would regret if we did not make use of the present moment, which is all in our favor." Wilhelm also said he believed Russia was not ready for war and that, if Austria attacked Serbia, it should act as quickly as possible. And so by early July, 4 possible outcomes appeared possible: a peaceful negotiated settlement, 2 an Austro-Serbian war in the Balkans, a continental war involving Austria, Russia, Germany, and probably France, or a world war if Britain and its empire joined France and Russia. Only Austria-Hungary and Russia had direct interests in the Balkans, but the European alliance system would probably pull other states in. However, neither the Triple Alliance nor the Triple Entente required automatic participation in war. Instead, each state had to decide how far it was prepared to go. The Triple Entente powers generally favored a negotiated settlement. If war did break out, Britain and France preferred keeping the conflict limited to the Balkans, although Russia was more prepared to accept a great power war over Serbia. Russia wanted to maintain its reputation as protector of the Balkan Slavs and potentially expand its influence around the Turkish Straits, which were extremely important to Russian trade and power projection. If a great power war began, France would back its ally Russia and hope Britain would join. In Britain, a major war was unpopular among the public, business circles, and some cabinet members. Some politicians, including Foreign Secretary Edward Grey, argued that if a major war erupted, Britain would be better off joining Russia and France. If Germany and Austria defeated France and Russia, British interests and security would suffer badly, but there was still strong opposition in the UK. As far as the Entente powers were concerned, a major war still appeared unlikely. Understanding Austro-German intentions is more complicated, and historians continue to debate them. Their leaders saw little advantage in a negotiated settlement. It would not solve the problem of Serbian nationalism or strengthen Austria's position in the Balkans. The best possible outcome would likely be a localized Austro-Serbian war. At the same time, starting such a war meant accepting the possibility of a continental conflict against France and Russia, and perhaps Britain. Germany had prepared plans for war against France and Russia, and believed that the longer it waited, the stronger Russia would become, and the greater its chances of defeat. Germany and Austria both chose to risk a European war against France and Russia to settle the Serbian question in Austria's favor. If a general war followed, victory would give Germany control over the continent. The wild card, naturally, was Britain. If the UK entered the war against them, an Austro-German victory would become far less likely, and would represent the worst possible outcome. So, facing rival alliances, conflicting goals, and different expectations, Europe's great powers entered the July crisis of 1914. After Germany gave Austria its blank cheque on July 6, Austria-Hungary intended to act quickly against Serbia, but that proved easier said than done. On July 7, the Austro-Hungarians discussed their next move. Although many wanted war, the government was divided. Hungarian Prime Minister István Tisza was initially reluctant. The Kingdom of Hungary already contained a large Serbian population, and war with Serbia would only deepen tensions. Tisza insisted that Austria-Hungary issue Serbia an ultimatum, giving one final chance for peace or providing justification for military action. Writing the ultimatum took time, and Tisza did not approve the final version until July 19. The wording was not the only delay. Many Austro-Hungarian soldiers were on leave for the harvest, meaning mobilization would take 2 weeks. Internationally, the French President and Prime Minister arrived in St. Petersburg on July 20 for a planned meeting with the Russians, meaning that if Austria sent its ultimatum before the French leaders returned home, Moscow and Paris could quickly coordinate a response. Historians debate how much the French and Russians already knew about the coming Austrian ultimatum, but they used the meeting to present an image of complete unity. As President Raymond Poincaré told the Russians, "We shall have weighty matters to discuss. I am sure we shall agree on all points, but there is one question which is very much in my mind: our understanding with England. We must get her to come into our alliance." Clark 443. The Austro-Hungarians waited until the French leaders were at sea on July 23 before sending the ultimatum to Serbia. Of its 10 demands, most focused on arresting Serbian officials and suppressing anti-Habsburg propaganda. To achieve this, the ultimatum required Serbia to accept the collaboration in Serbia of organs of the imperial and royal government. This effectively meant surrendering Serbian sovereignty, and the Austrians had intentionally written the ultimatum so that Serbia would have little choice but to reject it and give Austria a reason to declare war. Belgrade responded within the 48-hour deadline and accepted every point except those that violated the Serbian constitution, such as allowing Austro-Hungarian officials to prosecute Serbian citizens. The ultimatum sparked a wave of intense diplomatic activity. The Entente powers now fully understood how serious the crisis had become, which until then had largely unfolded behind closed doors in Vienna and Berlin. London, Paris, and St. Petersburg condemned the ultimatum, while Britain proposed mediation talks involving Britain, France, Germany, and Italy. Berlin rejected the idea. Russo-Austrian relations were now extremely tense. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Sazonov even shouted at the Austro-Hungarian ambassador during a meeting, "I know what it is. You intend to make war on Serbia. The German newspapers have been pushing you forward. You are setting Europe on fire. You are taking on a tremendous responsibility. You will see what effect this has in London and Paris, and perhaps elsewhere as well." The Tsar ordered partial mobilization of 4 military districts on July 24, followed by the period preparatory to war on the 26th. The Russian army started calling up reservists, collecting supplies, and promoting officers. At the same time, the Tsar wanted to ensure these measures did not look as though they were aimed at Germany. So, Austria-Hungary had Germany's blank check and had ensured that its ultimatum to Serbia would be unacceptable. On July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. The conflict was still regional, but that would soon change through the chain of events that followed. In reality, Russia's partial mobilization was an illusion. The General Staff had no plans for partial mobilization, and Tsar Nicholas's generals warned him that it would interfere with a possible full mobilization, while still likely alarming Germany. Military and political leaders across all the powers faced the same problem. If one army mobilized, its neighbor would feel compelled to do the same or risk an early defeat, especially because modern railways could bring enemy troops to the border within days. This dilemma gave military leaders greater influence during the crisis. On July 30, after overcoming his final doubts, the Tsar ordered full mobilization. All attention now shifted toward Germany. Between July 29 and August 1, Tsar Nicholas and Kaiser Wilhelm exchanged a series of urgent telegrams. Signing them affectionately as Nicky and Willy, the two cousins expressed their affection for each other while also making demands. On July 30, Willy wrote to Nicky, "I have now received reliable reports of serious preparations for war along my eastern frontier. The responsibility for my empire's security forces me to take preventive defensive measures. My friendship for you and your empire, passed down to me by my grandfather on his deathbed, has always been sacred, and I have honestly supported Russia many times. Europe's peace can still be preserved by you if Russia agrees to stop the military measures that threaten Germany and Austria-Hungary." London once again attempted mediation, including a proposal that Austro-Hungarian forces halt at Belgrade. On the 29th, German Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg asked Britain to remain neutral if Germany promised not to attack French possessions. Foreign Secretary Edward Grey was now desperately seeking clarification from his own cabinet, 2/3 of which had privy. And so, by early July, 4 possible outcomes had emerged: a peaceful, negotiated settlement, an Austro-Serbian war in the Balkans, a continental war involving Austria, Russia, Germany, and probably France, or a world war if Britain and its empire joined France and Russia. Only Austria-Hungary and Russia had direct interests in the Balkans, but the European alliance system would probably pull other states into the conflict. However, neither the Triple Alliance nor the Triple Entente required automatic participation in war. Instead, every state had to decide how far it was prepared to go. The Triple Entente powers generally preferred a negotiated settlement. If war erupted, Britain and France wanted to keep the conflict confined to the Balkans, although Russia was more willing to accept a great power war over Serbia. Russia wanted to preserve its reputation as protector of the Balkan Slavs and potentially expand its influence around the Turkish Straits, which were crucial to Russian trade and power projection. If a great power war came, France would support its ally Russia and hope Britain would join. In Britain, a major war was unpopular among the public, business circles, and some cabinet members. Politicians such as Foreign Secretary Edward Grey believed that if a major war broke out, Britain's position would be stronger if it joined Russia and France. If Germany and Austria defeated France and Russia, British interests and security would suffer badly. But there was still strong opposition to war in the UK. As far as the Entente powers were concerned, a major war still appeared unlikely. Understanding Austro-German intentions is more difficult, and historians continue to debate them. Their leaders saw little advantage in a negotiated settlement. It would not solve the problem of Serbian nationalism or strengthen Austria's position in the Balkans. The best possible outcome would likely be a limited Austro-Serbian war. At the same time, starting such a war meant accepting the possibility of a continental conflict against France and Russia, and perhaps Britain. Germany had already prepared plans for war against France and Russia, and believed that the longer it waited, the stronger Russia would become, and the greater the danger of defeat. Germany and Austria therefore chose to risk a European war against France and Russia in order to settle the Serbian issue in Austria's favor. If a general war broke out, victory would give Germany the chance to dominate the continent. The wild card, naturally, was Britain. If the UK entered the war against them, an Austro-German victory would be far less likely and would represent the worst possible outcome. So, facing rival alliances, conflicting goals, and different expectations, Europe's great powers entered the July crisis of 1914. After Germany gave Austria its blank check on July 6, Austria-Hungary intended to act quickly against Serbia. But this proved easier said than done. On July 7, the Austro-Hungarians discussed their next move. Although many were eager for war, the government remained divided. Hungarian Prime Minister István Tisza was initially hesitant. The Kingdom of Hungary already contained many Serbs, and war with Serbia would only make tensions worse. Tisza insisted that Austria-Hungary send Serbia an ultimatum, giving one final chance for peace or providing justification for eventual military action. Preparing the ultimatum took time, and Tisza approved the final text only on July 19. The wording of the ultimatum was not the only delay. Many Austro-Hungarian troops were away on leave for the harvest, and mobilization would require 2 weeks. Internationally, the French President and Prime Minister arrived in St. Petersburg on July 20 for a scheduled meeting with the Russians. If Austria delivered the ultimatum to Serbia before the French leaders returned home, Moscow and Paris might quickly coordinate a joint response. Historians debate how much the French and Russians already knew about the coming Austrian ultimatum. But they used the meeting to present an image of complete unity. As President Raymond Poincaré told the Russians, his main concern was Britain. "We shall have weighty matters to discuss. I am sure we shall agree on all points, but there is one question which is very much in my mind: our understanding with England. We must get her to come into our alliance." The Austro-Hungarians waited until the French leaders were at sea on July 23, before sending the ultimatum to Serbia. Of the 10 demands, most focused on arresting Serbian officials and suppressing anti-Habsburg propaganda. To accomplish this, the ultimatum demanded that Serbia accept the collaboration in Serbia of organs of the imperial and royal government. This was essentially a demand for Serbia to surrender its sovereignty, and the Austrians had deliberately written the ultimatum so that the Serbs would have little choice but to reject it and give Austria a reason to declare war. Belgrade responded within the 48-hour deadline and accepted every point except those that violated the Serbian constitution, such as allowing Austro-Hungarian officials to prosecute Serbian citizens. The ultimatum sparked a wave of intense diplomatic activity. The Entente powers now fully understood the seriousness of the crisis, which until then had largely unfolded behind closed doors in Vienna and Berlin. London, Paris, and St. Petersburg condemned the ultimatum, while Britain proposed mediation talks involving Britain, France, Germany, and Italy. Britain had previously opposed war. Cabinet member John Burns summed up the decision. Situation seriously reviewed from all points of view, it was decided not to decide. Britain still refused to say whether it would join the Entente if a general war broke out. Hollweg was now uncertain about British intentions and tried to restrain the Austro-Hungarians, even suggesting the halt in Belgrade plan. Meanwhile, German Chief of Staff Helmuth von Moltke was urging Conrad to attack. This prompted Conrad to ask, who actually rules in Berlin, Bethmann or Moltke? But the Austro-Hungarians argued that it was now too late to change direction, and occupying Belgrade temporarily would not accomplish their goals. Moltke also started pushing Germany toward mobilization, because the German war plan relied on speed to prevent a two-front war. The Schlieffen plan required German armies to defeat France first, while Russia was still mobilizing, then move German forces east. If Russia mobilized first, Germany would be placed at a disadvantage. The Germans had begun preparations on July 28, but on the 31st, Kaiser Wilhelm announced pre-mobilization. The state of threatening danger of war, the decision triggered another burst of telegrams. Germany demanded that Russia stop its mobilization, while at the same time asking Austria-Hungary to prepare for operations against Russia. The Germans also requested French and British neutrality in what appeared to be an approaching Russo-German war. In Britain, a third royal cousin, King George, now appealed to the Tsar to end mobilization. Prime Minister Herbert Asquith remembered the moment when he presented a draft telegram to the king. The poor king was hauled from his bed, and one of my strangest experiences was sitting with him. I read the message and the proposed answer. All he did was suggest that it should be made more personal and direct by the insertion of the words, "My dear Nicky," and the addition at the end of the signature, "Georgi." And so, as July ended, European capitals were flooded with a frantic exchange of diplomatic messages. For many military leaders, however, there was no longer time for more discussion, and they began pressuring politicians to act. On July 31, French General Joseph Joffre asked his government to abandon its more passive policy and mobilize. President Poincaré described the meeting, which continued into the early hours of August 1. Joffre appeared with the placid face of a calm, resolute man whose only fear is lest France, outstripped by German mobilization, the most rapid of them all, might speedily find herself in an irreparable state of inferiority. France finally mobilized at 4 p.m. on August 1. In Berlin, Moltke was having the same discussion with Chancellor Hollweg, and 30 minutes later, Germany announced its mobilization. By 7 p.m., Moscow informed Berlin that Russia would not halt its mobilization, and Germany therefore declared war on Russia. On August 2, German troops began moving, not east, but west into neutral Luxembourg. This followed the Schlieffen Plan, which the Germans described as a strategic necessity. Britain's position was still uncertain. London sent unclear messages to Berlin suggesting Britain might remain neutral if Germany did not attack France. Kaiser Wilhelm then asked Moltke to abandon the Schlieffen Plan and halt his armies before they crossed into France. Von Moltke replied that stopping the enormous and complicated mobilization was impossible and suicidal. The Kaiser was furious, and his response revealed that he did not fully understand his own military system. Your illustrious uncle would not have given me such an answer. If I order it, it must be possible. Soon afterward, the Kaiser discovered that Britain had made no formal offer to remain neutral, and gave his armies permission to proceed with the plan and invade Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. By August 2, British public opinion had shifted toward intervention. Britain informed France that it would block German naval movements in the Channel and protect Belgian neutrality. Belgian neutrality was Britain's final red line, but Germany had already begun moving toward it. On the same day, Germany delivered Belgium an ultimatum that had been prepared on July 26 as the Germans claimed France intended to enter Belgium, leaving Germany no choice but to move preemptively. If Belgium resisted, Germany would treat it as an enemy. Brussels responded to Berlin on August 3. The intentions ascribed to France are in contradiction with the formal declarations made to us. The infringement of independence with which the German government threatens her would constitute a flagrant violation of international law. No strategic interest justifies such a breach of law. The Belgian government is firmly resolved to repel every infringement of its rights, by all means in its power. That same day, the final dominoes started falling. Italy announced that it would remain neutral and would not join its Triple Alliance partners in the war. Germany claimed France was preparing to attack it, which was untrue, and declared war on France. On August 4, German troops entered Belgium. Belgium appealed to Britain, France, and Russia to guarantee its independence, and Britain declared war on Germany. By August 4, Europe's great powers were at war, and the First World War had begun. Over the next 4 years, roughly 20 million people would die, but even before the killing ended, arguments were already raging over the war's origins and who was responsible, and those debates have never truly stopped. After the war broke out, each of the powers published a statement making its case for how the July crisis should be understood and essentially blamed the other side. After the war, both sides continued blaming each other, while the Allies placed full responsibility on the Central Powers in the post-war peace treaties. Since then, the evidence from 1914 has been interpreted in many different ways as historians have tried to determine who was responsible for starting the war. For years, many historians concluded that all the powers shared some responsibility for the war. In the 1960s, German historian Fritz Fischer presented one of the most influential arguments. He argued that German political and military elites had ambitious plans and wanted to achieve them through war. The Fischer School argues that Germany had long prepared for a war against Russia and France, and directly encouraged Austro-Hungarian actions that escalated the crisis. More recently, other individual powers have been highlighted for their roles in the crisis. Sean McMeekin argued that Russia's actions transformed a Balkan conflict into a continental war, while Niall Ferguson blamed Britain for its mistakes. Other recent interpretations, such as Christopher Clark's sleepwalker theory, suggest that the war was largely unintended and grew out of miscalculations, misunderstandings, and perceived insecurities. He argues that Germany believed Russia and Britain were unlikely to intervene, and did everything it could to keep the conflict limited to the Balkans. Another debate focuses on whether the war was inevitable. The recent consensus is that the alliance system did not force any state to fight, as Italy demonstrated by remaining neutral in 1914. This view emphasizes that there were many moments when events could have taken another direction, such as if Austria had moved more quickly against Serbia, or if Britain had clearly stated its position from the beginning of the crisis. There is also debate about the culture and mentality of 1914. Historian James Joel, for example, argues that the cultural, military, and strategic zeitgeist viewed war as a practical, and even desirable, tool for social change and defending national interests. Since modern warfare also required rapid mobilization according to railway timetables, military commanders became as important as, or even more important than, politicians during the crisis. But their rigid strategies could not adapt to political needs. Meaning, perceived military necessity began directing political decisions. Russian politicians wanted partial mobilization without frightening Germany, but ended up doing exactly that, while German politicians did not want Britain to enter the war, yet their armies marched into Belgium and achieved exactly that. This was the opposite of Clausewitz's idea that war is politics by other means, and is crucial to understanding how the crisis turned into a world war. The war that began with the July crisis in 1914 lasted more than 4 years. The debate among historians trying to understand it still continues more than a century later. But those future arguments were far from the thoughts of Europe's people in August 1914. Men from every city, town, and village hurried to their mobilization depots, troop trains raced toward the borders, and armies marched toward the enemy beneath the hot summer sun. Many civilians and soldiers became caught up in a kind of war fever, known in Germany as the spirit of 1914. Fueled by jingoistic newspaper headlines and, soon afterward, organized government propaganda. Crowds gathered to see the men depart, while women placed flowers into the muzzles of their rifles. In Austria-Hungary, people rioted against local Serbs. In Paris, angry citizens looted dairy shops believed to belong to a German company, although they were actually Swiss. But enthusiasm for the war was not as widespread as once believed. For millions, particularly in rural areas, the war brought uncertainty and fear. French military doctor Louis Maufrey remembered the moment the news reached his village. Everyone stopped as if frozen in place. We understood. The women began crying, while the men, standing motionless on the sidewalk, stared at the clock tower as the bell rang. When the ringing ended, a deep silence followed. Some had also hoped that internationally minded socialists could prevent a war through a general strike across the continent. But despite a handful of demonstrations, most socialist parties and unions supported their governments. The German Social Democrats unanimously voted for war credits, while French anti-war socialist leader Jean Jaurès was assassinated by a radical nationalist. His colleague, Gustave Herve, rallied to the cause. Between Imperial Germany and Republican France, there's no hesitation. Our choice is made. Vive la France! And so, Europe's great powers went to war for the first time in a century. Once the armies finally on the battlefield, the fears of those who had not celebrated in the streets would prove justified. The German plan, known as the Schlieffen or Schlieffen-Moltke-Plan, called for most German armies to move through neutral Belgium before sweeping into France in a broad arc, passing west of Paris to surround and destroy the French within 6 weeks. After that, German forces could move east to confront Russia, which was expected to mobilize much more slowly. The plan overlooked serious logistical problems and probably required more soldiers than Germany actually had. But most of the 1.7 million German troops in the West marched into Belgium with confidence that victory was within reach. The Belgian army had only 100,000 men, far too few to halt the enormous German force crossing its borders, and they had not properly coordinated with the French and British because of Belgium's previous neutrality. Several important fortresses stood in the way, especially around Liege and Namur, and Belgian commanders hoped their garrisons could slow the German advance until French assistance arrived. But the Germans brought enormous siege weapons, including 420 ME guns and Austro-Hungarian 305 ME mortars. Belgian General Gard Lehmann commanded the forts near Liege. When the huge siege mortars opened fire, they threw shells weighing 1,000 kilos against us, with an explosive power beyond anything previously known. I had barely moved a few feet through the gallery when a tremendous blast swept past and hurled me violently onto the ground. I managed to rise and continue, only to be halted by a suffocating cloud of poisonous gas. Looking through the peephole, I saw with horror that the fort had fallen, its slopes and counterslopes reduced to a mass of rubble, while enormous flames shot from the fortress. As fighting continued around Liege, German officer Erich Ludendorff became a national hero after stepping forward and taking command of a brigade during the battle. The Belgians fought as hard as they could, but quickly withdrew, even after French and British troops entered Belgium to assist them. In occupied areas, German soldiers' fear of largely imaginary enemies and their sense of impunity led them to kill around 5,500 Belgian civilians, and they would later execute another 900 French civilians. Allied propagandists later used reports, both genuine and exaggerated, of these atrocities to build the story known as the Rape of Belgium. The French High Command still did not realize that the main German force was advancing through Belgium, and the much smaller British Expeditionary Force and French Fifth Army ran directly into it. The Germans pushed them back, forcing Allied forces into desperate delaying actions. The BEF briefly slowed the German advance at Mons on August 23, but German forces outflanked the British and forced them into retreat. Captain William Moret's unit never received the withdrawal order and became trapped. We decided to make them pay dearly for our lives. I ordered my men to fix bayonets in charge, which the brave fellows did magnificently, but we were shot down like ninepins. As I loaded my revolver, I was struck in the right wrist. I had not gone far when a bullet passed through the calf of my right leg, knocking me down. The Germans fired at me while I lay on the ground, trying to finish me off. That shot struck the sword I wore at my side. It deflected the bullet and saved my life, The rest of the BEF made another stand at Le Cateau on the 26th, while the French Fifth Army did the same at Guise on the 29th. And the exhausted BEF was too worn out to help them. The Germans continued forward at incredible speed, and the Allied Great Retreat carried on, affecting not only Allied soldiers, but also Belgian and French civilians fleeing alongside them. One of the saddest sights of that day was the huge columns of refugees on the main road to Guise. Carts heaped with household treasures, led by crying women and frightened children. These carts were ruthlessly swept off the road to make a passage for the troops. This was absolutely necessary, of course, in spite of its cruelty. While the Allies were collapsing in the north, the French army moved into action along the Franco-German border, according to its plan. French forces crossed into Germany and responded to German movements with attacks in the Ardennes region. The result was the Battle of the Frontiers, a huge series of clashes fought from August 14 to 24. French infantry attacked the Germans, often without sufficient artillery support, and sometimes directly against prepared German positions. The outcome was horrific slaughter. German artillery and machine guns cut down French soldiers by the tens of thousands. On August 22 alone, roughly 21,000 French soldiers were killed. French Captain Ignard was among the wounded. The charge had barely begun when it slowed under rapid close-range fire from the enemy, sheltered behind earthworks. I could not see my section. I looked behind me and saw that the AN sections had not followed our advance. I immediately moved toward the leading section, but I had barely taken a few steps when a bullet smashed into the top of my left arm. My shoulder was shattered, my arm hanging only by pieces of flesh. I fell half-conscious. The Germans had intended to let the French advance in the east, so they could assist the larger encirclement. But Crown Prince Ruprecht could not resist pursuing the retreating enemy, and his formations moved farther west than planned. Ironically, this helped the French because they now understood how serious the northern threat had become. French Commander General Joseph Joffre admitted that the plan had failed, dismissed dozens of generals, and took the risky step of moving troops by rail during active operations to reinforce his threatened left flank. At first, he wanted to gather a strike force near Amiens and attack the Germans from the side. But the German advance was too fast. The newly formed French Sixth Army, assembled in Paris and strengthened with units transferred from the east, would defend the French capital while threatening the German flank along the river Marne. Only 50 km from Paris. The German advance looked increasingly dangerous, and some officers at German headquarters believed the battle, and even the war, had already been won. But on the battlefield, conditions were becoming harder and harder for the Germans. Chief of the General Staff Helmuth von Moltke was growing anxious. He issued conflicting orders and began questioning the situation. We have had success, but have not yet won. Victory is the destruction of enemy resistance. When million-man armies oppose one another, the victor takes prisoners. Where are our prisoners? The worst is yet to come. He ordered his two westernmost armies to move east of Paris, and as they advanced, a gap began opening between them as they approached the Marne. French intelligence and aerial reconnaissance detected the sudden change and the gap on September 3. In a dramatic meeting, Joffre persuaded British Commander Field Marshal John French to send the exhausted BEF back into the line and ordered a general offensive. The fate of the country depends on the coming battle. All our efforts must go towards attacking and repelling the enemy. Troops that can no longer advance must hold the ground they've conquered at any cost, and be killed on the spot rather than retreating. In the present circumstances, no failure will be tolerated. The French committed everything they had to the Battle of the Marne, fought from September 5 to 12. They even transported several thousand men to the front in civilian taxicabs, while the Allies outnumbered the Germans 1.1 million to 750,000, although the Germans had 3,300 guns compared with the Allies' 3,000. In many sections of the front, however, it initially appeared that the Germans were gaining the advantage. French officer Paul Truffaut took part in a failed attack. The men fix bayonets. A flag is unfurled. It's too late to get to my own regiment. I pick up a dead man's weapon, slip on a cartridge belt, and join the advancing troop. It is rather scattered and pushing forward in every direction, urged on by the bugles. What's that I'm stepping on? The dead and wounded, friends and foes, the Allies, continued pressing forward. The BEF and part of the French Fifth Army advanced into the exposed gap between the German First and Second Armies, creating a serious crisis. For many German soldiers, French firepower was also becoming devastating. I looked death in the eye 100 times yesterday. We are lying opposite an enemy with superior artillery, whom it is impossible to approach, as he simply shoots our infantry to pieces. German headquarters was struggling through the fog of war. They failed to fully understand their tactical successes, but recognized the deadly danger created by Allied forces moving between their armies. Staff Officer Colonel Hensch visited the army commanders, and in a heavily debated episode, the Germans decided to retreat toward the river Ain. Moltke suffered an emotional collapse and was replaced by Erich von Falkenhayn. The Allies attempted to pursue the Germans across the Aisne, but lacked the necessary strength. France had been saved in what became known as the Miracle on the Marne. Some historians even argue that this battle secured long-term Allied victory in the war. There was still much more fighting to come in France before 1914 ended, but the French had halted the Germans at the Marne and destroyed the German war plan. Meanwhile, Austro-Hungarian armies were advancing where the war had begun, in the Balkans. From the beginning, Austro-Hungarian planners faced a difficult dilemma. At first, they were fighting only Serbia, but they could not send too many troops there because of the danger of war with Russia. Once Russia entered the war, concentrating on the east made sense, but politically, Austria-Hungary still had to attack Serbia. The solution was an awkward one. Chief of Staff Franz Conrad von Hetzendorf divided his forces into three: a small group for the Serbian front, a large force for the Russian front, and a medium-sized group, B echelon, that could be sent to either front. At first, Conrad sent B echelon to the Balkans. But he could not allow it to become trapped there, since he needed to move it east as soon as possible, so it would provide temporary support before returning to the trains and heading east. This meant the Austro-Hungarian attack against Serbia was rushed. General Oskar Potiorek, a rival of Conrad's, wanted a victory he could claim for himself, and his army of 140,000 men, many of whom were Serbs, Bosnians or Croats, possessed far more machine guns and artillery than the Serbian forces. The 200,000-strong Serbian army had experience from the recent Balkan wars and modern French artillery. But it lacked ammunition, machine guns, and rifles. The Austro-Hungarian troops launched the so-called or punitive expedition on August 12. Their advance from the west caught the Serbs by surprise. But they immediately faced logistical difficulties, heavy rain, and intense heat. The Serbian army had taken up a defensive position inland from the border, while Serbian irregulars, known as, harassed the Habsburg troops, who had been ordered to show no mercy. I command that during military operations, the utmost strictness, hardness, and distrust is to be shown to every if even one shot is fired at our troops in a village, are to be eliminated. Any resident found outside a village, or especially in a forest, is to be regarded as a bandit hiding weapons. If these people appear even halfway suspicious, they are to be eliminated. As they advanced, Austro-Hungarian troops massacred, captured as well as civilians, particularly in the town of Abak. Some estimates suggest that the Austro-Hungarians executed as many as 4,000 civilians in roughly 10 days, although the figures remain disputed, while also burning numerous villages. Serbian commander Radomir Putnik shifted his army westward and launched a counterattack on August 15 at the Battle of Sur Mountain. The Serbian night assault caught the exhausted Austro-Hungarians off guard. After a quick burst of fire, the Serbs charge in dense lines with triumphant cries. The attack comes too unexpectedly for the troops, for whom this is the first experience of close combat. They defend themselves valiantly at some places, but at other points, some lose their nerve. After several days of fierce fighting, the Austro-Hungarians withdrew and had evacuated Serbian territory by August 24. Some Serbian troops retaliated against surrendering Austro-Hungarians after learning about the Habsburg atrocities. The First World War's opening campaign ended with a Serbian victory, costing 17,000 Serbian troops killed and wounded, while the Austro-Hungarians suffered 20,000 killed and wounded and 4,500 prisoners. Serbian units then launched raids into Austrian Bosnia, but the population did not rise against Vienna as Belgrade had hoped. So Serbia had achieved an unexpected victory against Austria-Hungary, but the stakes were greater on the Russian front, where both sides immediately went on the offensive. The Eastern Campaign began with problems for the Austrians. There were no detailed war plans coordinated with Germany, and both sides assumed the other would have more troops available to fight the Russians than they actually did. Conrad wanted Germany to attack from East Prussia, but the Germans refused. Things became worse because Austrian mobilization was slower than expected, while Russian mobilization was much faster. Deployment was another problem, since Conrad's last-minute changes meant troops were unloaded far from their intended starting positions and then had to march dozens of extra kilometers under the summer heat. Many reservists were already exhausted before the campaign even started. The Russians also had more troops, 750,000, compared with 500,000, considerably more cavalry, and far more and better artillery. Their artillery crews had also been trained in indirect fire through their experience in the Russo-Japanese War. Even so, Conrad launched a major offensive northward to threaten Russian Poland and the rear of Russian forces facing East Prussia. Meanwhile, Russian General Nikolai Ivanov planned to move the armies of his southwest front toward Austrian Lemberg and eventually crack Dude at first. The Austro-Hungarians succeeded. On August 23–24, they drove the Russians back at Kranich through determined infantry attacks, although they suffered heavy losses from highly skilled Russian artillery. Even so, General Viktor Dankl remained confident. Russians are fleeing everywhere. Our troops were magnificent. The men are unstoppable. They charge at the enemy with unrelenting vigor. The Russians, as long as they do not outnumber us too heavily, are no match for us. The Battle of Komarv produced a similar result a few days later, as the Austro-Hungarians once again forced the Russians into retreat. But the exhausted Austrian forces lacked the numbers and strength needed to complete the encirclement. Once again suffering heavy casualties, the unrelenting cannonade turned the battlefield into a living hell. And the events of those terrible hours exceeded all previously held expectations of the war. Then, Russia made its move. General Alexei Brusilov's 8th Army led the attack into eastern Galicia, smashing the overstretched Austrians at Nila Lipa in late August and capturing Lemberg on September 3. They also struck the northernmost Austrian armies, which had become separated, and defeated them at the Battle of Rawa Ruska. A huge Austro-Hungarian counterattack failed to halt the Russian advance, forcing them to retreat deep into Habsburg territory and leaving the fortress under Russian siege. Fresh Russian forces and devastating artillery fire shattered the disorganized, exhausted, and thinly spread Austro-Hungarian formations. Discipline within the Habsburg units began collapsing, as one Austro-Hungarian soldier recalled. Train convoys of all military branches blocked the streets for miles. All of the languages of the monarchy could be heard screeching in a wild cacophony of voices. The drivers struck each other with their whips. Horse-mounted train commanders vented their frustration with repeated shots from their pistols. Hundreds of broken and bullet-ridden wagons lay in the ditches, alongside the bloated carcasses and the corpses of soldiers. As in Serbia, Habsburg defeat was followed by atrocities. The army suspected local Ukrainians of sympathizing with Russia and executed many as alleged spies. Estimates range from 1,500 to 30,000. A later Austro-Hungarian report found no widespread pro-Russian feeling or espionage among the Ukrainian population of East Galicia. By late September, Russia had captured Galicia and Bukovina, important oil fields, and the forts at Lemberg and Jaroslaw. Austria-Hungary suffered 320,000 killed and wounded, along with 100,000 prisoners. Another 100,000 Habsburg soldiers were cut off at. Russian losses were also heavy, 210,000 killed and wounded, and 40,000 prisoners. The difference was that Russia could absorb such losses, while Austria could not, especially because its officer corps was already small. Austria-Hungary's eastern offensive ended in disaster. In fact, Russia's Galicia offensive had achieved its strategic objective of crippling the Habsburg armies. At the same time, however, the Russian offensive into East Prussia ended very differently. When war broke out, the Russian Empire rushed to mobilize and put pressure on Germany as quickly as possible to support France. On August 17, two Russian armies crossed into East Prussia, hoping to surround the smaller German forces and threaten Berlin. The Russian invasion force numbered 500,000 men and roughly 1,650 guns, while the Germans had only 200,000 men and 770 guns. But the Germans possessed the advantage of local railway lines and the Angarap defensive position, which was protected by several lakes. The Russians, meanwhile, had to move across difficult terrain, poor roads, and limited supplies. Their armies were also divided by thick forests and numerous lakes, while their commanders were in conflict with their superior. As Russian forces occupied German villages, the German press filled with sensational stories of atrocities. Most were exaggerated, but Russian troops did burn several small towns and villages and killed nearly 1,500 civilians, usually based on unfounded suspicions of resistance or espionage. This strengthened German beliefs about Russian barbarism and encouraged commanders to launch a rushed counterattack. On August 19, Corps Commander General Hermann von Franwa ignored orders and attacked the easternmost Russian army too early and without sufficient artillery support. The resulting Battle of Gumbinnen saw General Pavel Rennenkampf's forces push the Germans back. A Russian officer remembered the battle's intensity. "The fire we opened on the enemy all along the line was so precise and deliberate that the Germans, having suffered huge casualties, had to stop and drop to the ground." Many of them were killed here in these open attacks, as they advanced in columns keeping tight formation. Then German aerial reconnaissance and radio intercepts of uncoded Russian messages revealed that the entire German position was threatened by General Alexander Samsonov's army to the south. German commander Maximilian von Prittwitz planned to abandon all of East Prussia and retreat toward the Vistula River. But the Army High Command removed him. Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff replaced him, while an army corps was transferred from France. However, the German 8th Army staff already had a battle plan. The Germans intercepted Rennenkampf's orders, telling his army not to continue the advance, meaning he would not join forces with Samsonov. German units were rapidly moved south by rail, and on August 23 they launched a two-sided attack against Samsonov's unsuspecting army. Chaos spread through the Russian lines as exhausted, hungry, and thirsty soldiers suddenly found themselves pushed back along both flanks. Samsonov misunderstood the situation and ordered his army deeper into the trap. By the time the Russians realized what was happening, it was already too late. By August 30, Samsonov's army had been completely destroyed. He took his own life, while the survivors withdrew across the border. German newspapers published a dramatic description of the slaughter. The sight of Russians driven into two huge lakes or swamps to drown was ghastly, and the shrieks and cries of the dying men and horses he will never forget. So fearful was the sight of these thousands of men, with their guns, horses, and ammunition struggling in the water, that, to shorten their agony, they turned the machine guns on them. But even in spite of that, there was movement seen among them. For a week after, the Russians lost 92,000 prisoners, 50,000 dead and wounded, and 500 guns, compared with only 15,000 German killed and wounded. Ludendorff named it the Battle of Tannenberg, presenting it as historic revenge for the 1410 battle in which the Teutonic Knights had been defeated by the Kingdom of Poland. The victory established the reputations of the two German commanders, while the Tannenberg myth helped launch their later military and political careers. The Germans then turned their attention to who had failed to advance to support Samsonov. Trains quickly carried German units back north, while the two corps transferred from France finally arrived. During the Battle of the Masurian Lakes, fought from September 5 to 13, the German Eighth Army defeated the Russians and drove them out of all but a small section of East Prussia. This time, however, they failed to destroy the Russian army, which even managed a successful local counterattack in September, before the front finally stabilized. Seguibi September, a month of enormous fighting in Eastern Europe, had seen Serbia defeat Austria, Russia defeat Austria, and Germany defeat Russia. Yet none of these victories or defeats proved decisive, and the major powers continued searching for ways to break their enemies. The Austrians, especially, still hoped to destroy Serbia. They attacked again in September and November but failed, before finally capturing Belgrade in early December. The Serbs, supplied with fresh ammunition and weapons from France and Russia, counterattacked and retook their capital on December 15. Leaving the Balkan front deadlocked and Serbia with tens of thousands of hungry, freezing, and sick refugees it could barely support. Farther east, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and German armies all launched major offensives during the autumn and early winter of 1914. The Habsburg army briefly lifted the siege in October, before Russian forces pushed them back again, while the Germans stopped another Russian invasion of East Prussia at. The Germans and Austro-Hungarians advanced toward Warsaw and came close to destroying the Russian forces before a Russian counterattack drove them back. Further German attacks later resulted in the capture of in December. That same month, the Austro-Hungarians narrowly avoided another disaster by stopping a major Russian offensive at the Battle of Limanowa, keeping Russian forces away from Krakow and the Hungarian interior. These battles are largely forgotten today, but they cost both sides hundreds of thousands of casualties and caused immense suffering for millions of soldiers fighting in wet, freezing conditions while facing severe shortages of artillery shells and other supplies. The Ottoman Empire's entry into the war on the side of the Central Powers in October opened several new fronts. All preserve the same length, facts, meaning, tone, and sequence, while making the language more natural, simple, and engaging. The Sultan and Caliph declared a global jihad against the Allies, but it had little effect as the British captured Basra and the Russians launched an attack in the Caucasus. Their Bergman offensive failed, and Ottoman War Minister Enver Pasha ordered an ambitious counteroffensive in December. Around 100,000 Ottoman soldiers marched into the Allahekber Mountains to carry out a complicated battle plan, but the campaign quickly became a deadly catastrophe. Temperatures in the mountains were brutally cold, and poorly equipped Ottoman units were trapped in powerful snowstorms. Tens of thousands froze to death, while Russian defenses held firm with the help of superior artillery. The surviving Ottoman troops retreated into Anatolia in January, after suffering up to casualties. Fighting also spread across the globe. Japan joined the Allies to honor its alliance with Britain, but also to expand its own empire at Germany's expense. Japanese troops surrounded the German colony at Tsingtao in China and captured it after a 3-month siege. In Africa, British, French, and German colonial forces fought across the west, south, and east. On the high seas, British and German naval forces clashed in several deadly but inconclusive engagements, leaving Britain in control of the oceans while the main German fleet remained intact. After months of bloody combat, several fronts reached a stalemate, and the armies began digging in, usually through extensive systems of trenches, but it was on the Western Front where 1914 introduced modern trench warfare on an enormous scale. Trenches were certainly not new by 1914. They had existed since ancient times and had become even more common in recent conflicts such as the Crimean War, the U.S. Civil War, the Boer War, and the Russo-Japanese War. But the trench networks built by the French, British, and German armies in 1914 were unprecedented in their size, complexity, and ability to withstand enemy attacks. After the original war plans collapsed, both sides attempted to outflank one another in what became misleadingly known as the Race to the Sea. Even as armies pushed forces farther north, the front lines gradually hardened. By October 1914, a nearly continuous network of trenches stretched from the Swiss border to the English Channel, forming a front that would become deeper and more elaborate over the next 3 years. Mobile warfare lasted only 3 months in 1914 before the failure of the major offensives gave way to trench warfare. Understanding why those offensives failed and why later attacks had little chance of breaking the stalemate helps explain the rise of trench warfare. The arms industry had developed deadly new technologies in the years before 1914. And when these weapons were used on an enormous scale for the first time, the results were devastating. So devastating, in fact, that they forced entire armies to seek protection inside trenches. The weapons of 1914 made open battle far deadlier than during the last major European great power wars of 1870 and 1866. The deadliest weapon was artillery. The French 75M was widely considered the finest field gun in the world, and for good reason. Its hydraulic recoil system allowed it to fire bursts of 15, 30 rounds per minute for short periods, compared with roughly 5 rounds per minute from the Prussian C-64 field gun of 1870. The field guns of 1914 could reach targets 7,000 to 11,000 m away, far beyond the 3,500 m range of the weapons used in 1870. The Germans, in particular, possessed heavy artillery capable of firing larger shells over even greater distances. The shells themselves were also far more powerful than those used in earlier wars because of advances in chemical explosives, such as melinite. Small arms had also become considerably deadlier. British Lee-Enfield, German Mauser, and French Lebel rifles offered better ranges and faster rates of fire thanks to smokeless powder and multi-round clips, reaching up to 15 rounds per minute per rifle. Modern machine guns such as the Maxim, Vickers, and Saint-Étienne could fire around 500 bullets every minute, roughly 5 times the rate of the multi-barreled mitrailleuse used in 1870. Military experts were already aware of these developments before the war. They had witnessed them on a smaller scale, particularly during the Russo-Japanese War, and recorded their effects in field manuals. Bullets can still kill a man at 2,000 m. At ordinary ranges, they go through several men. What commanders did not know was how these weapons would transform battlefield tactics. Would they favor attackers or defenders? Some theorists believed they could create a defensive stalemate, while others, especially in France, argued that an aggressive attacking spirit would win out, as it had for the Japanese in several battles during 1904-05. French Captain Billard defended this offensive mentality in 1913. War is not so much about capability as it is about courage. Science will always yield to devotion and firmness. Above all else, every trooper must be inculcated with this spirit of ultimate sacrifice, which will later reveal itself in the offensive. But the battles of August and September proved that these new weapons made attacking across open ground extremely dangerous. As French officer Charles de Gaulle experienced himself, suddenly the enemy's fire became precise and concentrated. Second by second, the hail of bullets and the thunder of the shells grew stronger. Those who survived lay flat on the ground, amid the screaming wounded and the humble corpses. In an instant, it had become clear that not all the courage in the world could withstand this fire. As armies continued fighting in the open, men were dying in enormous numbers. After only 5 months of fighting in the West, France had suffered 265,000 dead, Germany around 85,000, and Britain about 30,000 from its much smaller army. Most of these losses came during August and September, before trench warfare had fully developed. These casualty levels were proportionally higher than in any other year of the war and simply could not continue. The only refuge was the relative protection offered by trenches. As French officer Pierre Dupuy observed, "The fire of the heavy guns is admirably precise and well regulated." The other day I saw 6 shell craters in a 30 m diameter circle, and these shells came from more than 7,000 m away. But however accurate their fire, a trench gives shelter untouchable by artillery. Well dug in infantry can only be dislodged by infantry, and properly by enemy bayonets. Another factor that brought mobile warfare to an end and ensured trench warfare would last was the difficulty of coordinating attacks. With defensive firepower so powerful and trench systems developing quickly, armies struggle to maintain any gains through infantry or artillery, especially when trying to coordinate both together. Artillery crews found it difficult to operate in unfamiliar conditions. During mobile warfare, they often fired at visible targets, but in set-piece battles against trench networks, gunners had to hit targets at distances beyond their training while relying on indirect fire. This required far more information, something that was difficult to obtain in 1914 because command and communication systems were still limited. Aerial reconnaissance provided some help, but aircraft were still scarce, while crews could move, camouflage, and conceal their guns from observation. Infantry faced an even greater challenge. Assaulting an entrenched enemy was extremely dangerous, and mistakes were common. Military regulations did include tactics designed to reduce exposure to enemy fire, such as advancing in shorter bursts with smaller groups, but officers often struggled to coordinate their troops. Attacks therefore frequently moved forward in dense formations, which were then torn apart by defensive fire. The Germans made exactly this mistake at Ypres in October. As British Captain Henry Dillon witnessed, a great gray mass of humanity was charging, running for all God would let them, straight onto us not 50 yards off. I have never shot so much in such a short time, and could not have been more than a few seconds and they were down. But perhaps the biggest challenge was coordinating the two main combat arms so that artillery support could reach the right place at the right time and help the infantry break through enemy trenches. There were not enough liaison officers to pass infantry requests to the nearest artillery batteries, while over-eager infantry officers sometimes launched attacks before waiting for support. French Captain Alphonse Grasset remembered the suffering of his men without artillery support. "My company was sustaining heavy losses. Evidently its action was hampering the enemy who concentrated the combined fire of his infantry, artillery, and machine guns on us." Among the men lying on the ground, one could no longer distinguish the living from the dead. We had no support from our artillery. And yet there were guns in our division and in the Army Corps, besides those destroyed on the road. Where were they? Why didn't they arrive? We were alone. French Commander-in-Chief Joseph Joffre eventually issued a direct warning to infantry officers not to attack without artillery support after receiving reports that some units were doing exactly that. He blamed this on a misunderstanding of offensive doctrine, although inadequate training was also an important factor. Another factor that allowed trench warfare to develop was the difficulty of command and control. The armies entering the war were larger than ever before. After mobilization, the German army had around 2.3 million men, while the French army reached roughly 2.9 million. Military thinkers had already questioned how such enormous armies could receive and follow orders quickly, and whether commanders could effectively control forces of such immense size. Those fears were quickly proven correct. Commanders struggled to direct their armies, especially the Germans, who had to move the farthest and fastest. The German First and Second Armies lost contact on the right wing, and Helmuth von Moltke eventually accepted the First Army's turn east only after it had already taken place, instead of approving or stopping the movement beforehand. Joffre also admitted that many of his generals were simply unable to manage their commands effectively, and he removed dozens of them during the autumn of 1914. Part of the problem was that communication technology could not keep up with the demands of modern warfare. There were too few telephones and telephone lines, while the ones that existed were frequently destroyed by artillery fire. French General Gascoigne was one of many officers frustrated by these shortages. A few km more of telephone wire would have been worth more to me than all the blathering on about combined arms and the unity of hearts between infantrymen and gunners. Wireless telegraphy remained primitive, and reliable voice radio would not appear until after the war. French intelligence could even intercept German wireless messages sent in plain language by units desperately asking for orders, ammunition, reinforcements, or simply trying to discover the positions of nearby formations. The Allies also experienced serious communication problems, as there were too few liaison officers to keep formations properly informed. British General Horace Smith-Dorrien later remembered how little information he had about French movements near Mons in August. "I had been given no information of the somewhat serious happenings in the French army on our right, which I learned years later, namely, that it had been forced back, and was already some 9 miles south of Mons, with a gap of at least 9 miles between the right of our two corps and the left of the French Ville Corps, thus leaving us in a very vulnerable, indefensible, and salient position. Communication often depended on mounted messengers carrying handwritten messages to headquarters or to the nearest working telegraph or telephone station. Such a system was simply too slow and inefficient for the complicated operational plans of 1914. Historian Larry Addington summarized the problem well. Like the fictional Dr. Frankenstein, the general staffs of Europe had created monsters that they could scarcely control and whose movements at a distance were difficult to gauge. Mobility and logistics created another major problem. Infantry could advance only on foot, while artillery depended on horses, which could only work for so long and were highly exposed to enemy fire. Meanwhile, defenders operating within their own territory could reinforce threatened sectors much faster by using the roads and railway networks behind their lines. The basic problem was that the attackers' limited tactical mobility could not overcome the defenders' greater operational and strategic mobility. Another reason mobile warfare gave way to trench warfare in 1914 was the growing difficulty of maintaining supplies. Attacking armies struggled to keep themselves supplied with food, fodder, ammunition, and reinforcements, while defending armies could maintain these supplies far more easily. The railway was the key factor. Whenever an army advanced into enemy territory, it moved farther from its own railheads. Since armies were not yet motorized, attacking troops could advance only as quickly as marching infantry, while their supplies could move only as fast as horse-drawn wagons. But perhaps the biggest challenge was coordinating the two main combat arms so that artillery support could reach the right place at the right time, allowing infantry to break through enemy trenches. There were not enough liaison officers to communicate what the infantry needed to the nearest batteries, and overly eager infantry officers did not always wait for support before launching an attack. French Captain Alphonse Grosset recalled the suffering of his men. "When artillery support was missing, my company was sustaining heavy losses. Evidently, its action was hampering the enemy, who concentrated the combined fire of his infantry, artillery, and machine guns on us. Among the men lying on the ground, one could no longer distinguish the living from the dead. We had no support from our artillery, and yet there were guns in our division and in the Army Corps, besides those destroyed on the road. Where were they? Why didn't they arrive? We were alone." French Commander-in-Chief Joseph Joffre even issued a direct warning to infantry officers not to attack without artillery support after receiving reports of units doing exactly that. He blamed it on a misunderstanding of offensive doctrine, although inadequate training also played an important role. Another factor that made trench warfare possible was the problem of command and control. The armies that entered the war were larger than ever before. Once mobilized, the German army numbered about 2.3 million men, while the French army reached about 2.9 million. How such enormous armies could receive and act on orders quickly, and whether commanders could effectively control such huge forces, had already worried military thinkers before the war. Those fears were quickly proven correct. Commanders struggled to direct their armies, especially the Germans, who needed to move the farthest and fastest. The German First and Second Armies lost contact on the right wing, and Helmuth von Moltke ultimately accepted the First Army's eastward swing only after it had already happened, instead of approving or stopping the move beforehand. Joffre also admitted that many of his generals simply could not manage their commands effectively, and he removed dozens of them during the autumn of 1914. Part of the problem was that communication technology could not keep up with the demands of modern warfare. There were not enough telephones or telephone lines, and those that did exist were often cut by artillery fire. French General Gascoigne was among those frustrated by these shortages. A few km more of telephone wire would have been worth more to me than all the combined arms and the unity of hearts between infantrymen and gunners. Wireless telegraphy was still primitive, and reliable voice radio would not arrive until after the war. French intelligence was even able to intercept German wireless messages sent in plain text by units desperately requesting orders, ammunition, reinforcements, or simply trying to locate neighboring formations. The Allies also suffered from communication failures, as there were too few liaison officers to keep formations properly informed. British General Horace Smith-Dorrien later recalled how little he knew about the French Army's movements near Mons. In August, I had been given no information of the somewhat serious happenings in the French Army on our right, which I learned years later, namely, that it had been forced back, and was already some 9 miles south of Mons, with a gap of at least 9 miles between the right of our two corps and the left of the French corps, thus leaving us in a very vulnerable, indefensible, and salient position. Communication was often reduced to mounted messengers carrying handwritten notes to headquarters or to the nearest functioning telegraph or telephone station. Such a system was simply not efficient enough to carry out the highly complex operational plans of 1914. Historian Larry Addington summarized the problem well. Like the fictional Dr. Frankenstein, the general staffs of Europe had created monsters that they could scarcely control and whose movements at a distance were difficult to gauge. Mobility and logistics were another problem. The only way for infantry to move forward was on foot, while artillery could move only with horses, which could be pushed only so hard and were extremely vulnerable to enemy fire. At the same time, defenders operating within their own lines could reinforce threatened areas much more quickly by using roads and rail networks behind the front. The basic problem was that the attackers' poor tactical mobility could not overcome the defenders' greater operational and strategic mobility. Another reason mobile warfare was replaced by trench warfare in 1914 was the growing supply problem. Attacking armies struggled to keep themselves supplied with food, fodder, ammunition, and reinforcements, while defending armies could do so much more easily. The key factor was the railway. As soon as a formation advanced into enemy-held territory, it moved farther away from its own railheads. Since armies were not yet motorized, the attacking force could move only as fast as marching infantry, while its supplies could travel only as fast as horse-drawn wagons.